This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. I'm going to do a lesson on how to do knitter's mattress stitch. This is the ideal stitch for sewing a side seam in your knitting, the kind of seams that are beautiful, invisible, and will earn you a blue ribbon at the fair. Now you'll need some supplies for this exercise. I started by knitting 2 samples. My samples are about 20 stitches wide. I have a few rows of waste yarn in the yellow, 20 rows of green yarn, and then a few rows of waste yarn again. Now, you will also need a tapestry needle and a length of yarn for sewing. I'm using matching yarn for sewing. You typically use the garment yarn for sewing your side seams. The tapestry needle could be metal or plastic. It has a big eye and a blunt tip. The blunt tip goes in between strands of yarn instead of splitting the yarn between its plies, and you'll get better results using blunt-tipped tapestry needles. To thread your tapestry needle, fold the end of the yarn over the needle and pinch it between your thumb and your forefinger. Then slide the needle out and just lay the eye of the needle down over the folded yarn and pull it through. Then you're threaded up. Now before you begin to sew, you need to visualize the vertical lines in the knitting. The knitting consists of columns of V-shaped stitches, and there are distinct vertical lines between the V-shaped stitches. In fact, I will lay the needle down on one of the vertical lines between 2 columns of knitting. Where you want to put your seam on the sample is you want to unroll the sample, and you want to go 1 complete stitch from the edge along a vertical line. You can tell you're 1 complete stitch from the edge because if you poke a needle through, you'll see 2 strands of thread laying on top of the needle. So I'm going to sew along this line on this swatch, and on this other swatch, unroll it a little, I'm going to sew along this line. And yes, I did steam my swatches lightly so that they would lay flat for sewing up on camera, and you'll probably have a better experience sewing if you steam your swatches too. Not a hard press with an iron, just hold the iron over the swatch and let the steam come out and saturate the yarn a little bit. Now, to take the first stitch, I go in one of the swatches between 2 V's, 1 stitch from the edge. I can tell it's 1 stitch because there are 2 threads on the edge side of my needle. Go under the horizontal bar that appears when I go between the 2 V's and out again. So I have 1 bar on top of my orange tapestry needle, and I draw the yarn through very, very loosely. And that's what I have. Now, to do the mattress stitch, you take a stitch on this swatch, then you take a stitch on this swatch, then a stitch here, a stitch here, a stitch here, alternating between swatches. So since my first stitch was on this swatch, my second stitch will be on this swatch, and I do the same thing. I go between the first 2 V's and catch that first vertical bar, 1 stitch from the edge, and draw the yarn through very, very loosely. Now it gets easier because I am going to go on this swatch for my next stitch, and I'm going to go in where this last bit of yarn came out. I go in exactly in the same spot. In other words, I go in a used hole and then go under 1 horizontal bar and out again. This is a 1 row, 1 bar mattress stitch. If you have really tiny stitches, you could go under 2 bars every time like that. But I often use a 1 bar mattress stitch, especially with this kind of large gauge knitting. So that's where that second stitch goes. In where the yarn came out and under 1 bar of the knitting, and draw through just crazy loosely. I'm going loosely because it makes it so easy for me to see where the next stitch goes. The last stitch was on this swatch, the next stitch is on this other swatch. I go in where the yarn comes out, I catch just the one bar in the used hole, out the new hole, draw through very, very loosely so that I can see what I'm doing. Go on this side now, in where I came out, catch the one bar, and draw through very loosely. Go to this side, go in where I came out, catch just the one bar, and then draw through very loosely. And let me get a few more stitches on and then show you a couple of things about this. And yes, you'll go much faster, but I'm trying to really be slow so you can see exactly what I'm doing and exactly what I am catching in between these vertical bars of stitches. Now after I've done a few stitches, you can see a couple of things. One of the things I want you to observe is that I'm always using this vertical bar right along here. If I were to stab my needle here, then my seam wouldn't look as good. My seam would go crooked. I'm keeping my seam straight, always using that vertical row to put my stitch. The same thing on the other side. I'm always using that right alongside that column of V's. After I've done a few stitches, I can pull up the yarn and watch as my seam just magically closes and nearly vanishes in between the two stitches. And in fact, if you flip the knitting over, there's definitely a ridge. That ridge is the stitch at the very edge from this sample and the stitch at the very edge from this sample. Now once you've drawn up, it's a little bit harder to see where the next stitch goes, but no problem. We'll just open things a little bit, and I can see this yarn moving as I open it, and I can see that the yarn came out of this spot right here, and so my next spot is right here. And I can continue on. Since you went to all the work of knitting the two samples, you might as well practice all the way from the bottom of the seam to the top of the seam. Besides, the whole time that you're practicing, you're getting better and better at visualizing exactly where to go, and you're speeding up. After you sew a few, you draw them up, and you continue on. You can practice all the way from the bottom of the swatch to the top of the swatch, and then again you want to get maximum use out of these swatches that you knitted, so flip it over, fold it like this, and sew another seam from here to here. So that's how to do mattress stitch to make beautiful side seams in your sweaters.